Okay, this is Mac Boland, and I'm going live now. Broadcast for believers and non-believers group discussion, and the topic is Israel and Palestine. And like a lot of the hot button topics, the ones that are full or controversial, this one is full of emotions and totally full of myths and ignorance. Now, before I get started on this, I just want to say that history was one of my two majors in college, the other one being business, minor in economics. Did post-grad study also in history, a lot on the Middle East, going all the way back to ancient times. Also in 24 years in the military, mostly in special forces, did numerous country studies, and have been to a lot of the countries, including Israel, Egypt, Sudan, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, etc. So, start off with Israel and the Palestinian situation is a situation that has been going on for years and years. Constant talk about a two-state solution. And I will state up front, I am 100% behind the Israeli position. Again, based on factual knowledge, based on experience, and the historical perspective. People talk about a two-state solution, and I'll cover that too. And the 900-pound gorilla that pretty much nobody talks about, and I'll cover that later too. To start with, let's go way back. And I'll talk about, when I say way back, let's talk about going to biblical times. So, Moses led the children of Israel out of bondage. Joshua eventually led them into the promised land. There were no Arabs at this time. There were kingdoms of Israel: Saul, David, Solomon. Palestine was a territory. Never, ever, in the history of the world, at any point, has there been a Palestinian state, a Palestinian nation, and the people who right now claim to be Palestinians who are Arabs. I mean, they started calling themselves Palestinians back in the 60s. There's never been, never existed, never has. Now, the Kingdom of Israel existed for many years. Then came numerous conquests, first Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar, then under Persia and Darius, then Alexander the Great, who came through, conquered the region, and then Rome. Now, interesting to note that during all this time frame, the Israelis and the Jewish people, the Hebrews, still lived in and had a formal government. And under Rome, the Hebrews were actually allowed to appoint self-government during that entire time frame when the Romans occupied the land. Still no Arabs. So when did the Arabs show up? That didn't happen until the invasion of Muhammad and the spread of the false prophet Muhammad and the spread of Islam. And the Muslims conquered the Holy Land, North Africa, spread throughout the Middle East into Asia. And again, this was all long after we had an established Kingdom of Israel and we had an actual Jewish state back then. So when we talk about about Muhammad and the Muslim invasions. And I'll point out, the former President Obama, the apologist in chief, who totally embarrassed himself at the National Prayer Breakfast one year, talking about Christians getting off their high horses about the Crusades. Yet the moron forgot to mention that, why were the Crusades formed? That was because of the illegal invasion and occupation of the Muslims of the Holy Land. And the control of that area passed in and out of hands throughout history. Eventually, the Ottoman Turks, probably one of the most ruthless and brutal empires in the history of the world, also the people who propagated the first modern genocide of the Armenians, control the land. So fast forward to 1916, World War I, and a British-sponsored and assisted uprising with the Arabs versus the Turks, who were also Muslims, but not Arabs. Different ethnicity. And just a real quick point, when we talk about ethnicity, Palestinians are not a different ethnicity. They're Arabs. Bedouins, etc. You can talk about all the Arabs. They're Arabs. They're not a different ethnicity, and the Palestinians aren't anything special. Different ethnicities would be like the Berbers in North Africa, the Eritreans in Ethiopia, Egyptians, Kurds, Turks, Iranians, who were actually Persians back in the day of the Persian Empire, and who actually even speak a different language. They speak Farsi. They don't speak Arabic. Anyway, so during World War I, Great Britain involved themselves with the Arabs. And if you haven't seen it, the movie Lawrence of Arabia is actually very accurate with the use of the Arabs with Great Britain to fight the Turks during World War I. Now, after World War I, Britain occupied the area. We went through World War II, and after World War II, Great Britain continued to occupy the area. Now, in 1936, interesting to note, there was another Arab revolt against British occupation. Great Britain could not understand, all the unrest. And so they formed a thing called the Peel Commission to figure out what the problem was. The problem was the objection of all the Jewish people living in a land that was theirs originally during this time frame in Israel. And so the Peel Commission suggested a two-state solution, which all the Arabs flatly denied and opposed. And at that time, the amount of land that would have been given to a Jewish state was probably smaller than Rhode Island. It only included part of Jerusalem and the areas that's now Tel Aviv. So that was 1936. Go forward to 1947. The British occupation was set to end in 1948. Again, a two-state solution was proposed. They would partition the land, and the amount of land given to an Israeli state was extremely dinky. And again, all the Arabs flatly opposed it. They opposed any Jewish state whatsoever, even though they were the people who were originally in control of that land, not the Arabs. So in 1948, UN Resolution 186 was formed, which would have created the Nation of Israel. Russia in the Security Council vetoed it, and all the Arab nations completely opposed it. In 1947, Arab countries launched an attack 5 Arab nations to completely destroy Israel. That was Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. They lost. And this is what created the so-called refugee crisis. People fleeing, Arabs fleeing the lands, fleeing the fighting. Ironically, they were told to leave under some kind of understanding that later, when Israel was wiped out, they would be able to return. And this was something that was even stated by the Syrian prime minister back in that day. And in 1949, when people talk about the West Bank, it was Jordan that occupied the West Bank. Now, Jordan was a country that was created during the partition of the area, and they're also Arabs. So they actually occupied the West Bank. So we move again now. 1967, Gamal Nasser, who was in charge of Egypt, strongly anti-Israeli and believer in pan-Arabism and a completely unified caliphate of Muslim nations, all combined, controlling North Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Ironically, on a side note, Saddam Hussein at the time was one of the people who was basically mentored and tutored by Gamal Nasser. Now, Israel, in response to the Arab militarization and buildup, launched a preemptive strike in the Six-Day War and completely crushed Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, at the time, who wasn't really at war with Israel, was told to stay out. They did not. They got involved in the war, and as a result, Israel pushed them out of and took control of the West Bank. Spoils of war. You fight, you lose. Guess what? You lose, you give it up. Now, at that point, the Arab League, which was formed a few years prior, went to Khartoum and Sudan, another infamous fundamentalist Arab-controlled country, which I had the misfortune of actually having to spend 3 months in and witnessing Islamic oppression firsthand. They decreed their famous 3 no's. No peace, no recognition, no negotiation of Israel. So what was Israel left to do? 1972, now during this time frame, you had the Palestinian refugee crisis. Most of the Palestinians that fled the fighting ended up in Jordan. Now, in 1972 was the famous terrorist incident. The Al-Fatah, which was a terrorist branch of the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization. Now they're basically who are just Arabs calling themselves Palestinians. Why? For political purposes. They fabricated a Palestinian flag. They made paraphernalia, shirts, etc., a shadow government, the PLO, calling themselves Palestinians. Well, guess what? Just because that's what you call yourselves doesn't mean that's what you are. You're not. You're Arabs. And you were never a state. You were never a nation. Ever. You probably never will be. So after the 3 no's and the Palestinians existed in Jordan in a very tumultuous relationship between Jordan, and the fact that Transjordan eventually became the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, and the great irony, which I'll get to later, things went back and forth. And in 1973, the Soviet Union got involved. Now, they armed Egypt and Syria. And in October, the infamous Yom Kippur War was launched by a surprise attack Egypt crossing the Suez Canal through the Sinai Peninsula and caught Israel by surprise. Syria launched an attack on the other side. Now, both these armies were equipped with modern Soviet equipment, tanks, the T-62 tank, which had IR, infrared capability. They were state-of-the-art. They had they had AKs, mortars, artillery, and they even had, at the time, the brand new Sagar anti-tank missile. And Israel, at a point, was pushed back, and they were practically on the brink of destruction. In fact, when they threw in the reserves, an entire regiment defending the Golan Heights was wiped out, trying to stem the Syrian assault, which they were able to do. Now, the Soviets were sending support to Egypt and Syria. The U.S. jumped in and started supporting Israel, sending them supplies. And amazingly enough, Israel was able to survive. They were able to hold off the attacks and then launch a counteroffensive. Now, at one point, this was probably, everybody, if you know history, you know about the Cuban Missile Crisis. But the Yom Kippur War in 1973 was probably as close to the brink of a Third World War we might have ever gotten because of the standoff that happened and then the involvement with the Soviets and the U.S. So the counteroffensive by Israel, they pushed Egypt all the way back across the Sinai Peninsula. We're on the verge of taking Egypt. They pushed Syria all the way back, and we're on the verge of overrunning their forces. And Jordan, again, screwed up, should have stayed out, offered minor support, and then backed off. Finally, at the end of the Yom Kippur War, a huge peace was brokered. Israel pulled back all their forces. Negotiations started, and Israel eventually gave back the Sinai Peninsula. The Sinai, which was a landmass greater than the entire country of Israel, oil reserves, everything, and they gave it back to Egypt in exchange for peace. Jordan, likewise, joined in and recognized Israel and made peace. The result, both those countries were kicked out of the Arab League. Syria was the biggest loser in the entire affair because they stayed anti-Israel and gave up the Golan Heights, which, looking over the valley, and I was in Israel, I trained with the Golani Brigade, the recon company. I stood on top of the Golan Heights. I looked over the valley, and I said to myself, there is no way Israel should ever, because of the strategic value and given the relationship with the Muslims in Lebanon and with Syria, ever give up the Golan Heights. Now, talk about something again that's very rarely mentioned. We talked about the refugee crisis. Around 700,000 Arabs, Palestinians, or Palestinians, who fled to Jordan. There is an enormous Palestinian population in the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. The problems got so bad in that country between the rulers at the time, King Hussein, and the PLO. In 1979, they launched an attack on the refugee camps known as Black September. This drove, in effect, the Palestinians out of Jordan. They eventually fled and ended up in Lebanon and in Beirut and in the refugee camps at Shatila and Burj Barajna and on the side of West Beirut. And like what always happens with the Palestinians and the PLO, trouble started right away. Terrorist attacks, unrest. a lot of fighting in eventually the attacks coming from Lebanon and through southern Lebanon into Israel prompted the Israeli army to invade Lebanon and occupy Beirut. Now, a lot is said again about what happened during that time frame. The actual attacks and massacres of the refugee camps were not carried out by Israelis. They were carried out by Christian militias who had been bullied and attacked, car bombed, and in fact, one of the Christian Phalange members, Bashir Jamal, was assassinated by Muslim factions. And the massacres that occurred in those refugee camps were carried out by Christian militias, not the Israelis or the Israeli army. Now, Israel eventually left Beirut. That did not stop the fighting. All the way back into the 80s, now the fighting was not between Israel or the Christians. It was between Muslim factions like the Amal and the Druze in West Beirut against the PLO. Why? Because the PLO is a terrorist organization following their own self-interest and couldn't get along with anybody. They were eventually expelled and they left. Now, there still is, to this day, a PLO element that occupies and lives in southern Lebanon and still to this day launches terrorist attacks from there into Israel. Now, in 2000, when the Israeli Prime Minister Barak and Yasser Arafat met, and this is when Clinton was in office, they tried to form a two-state solution. 14 days they negotiated. And for 14 straight days, Yasser Arafat said no. No to everything. No to peace. No to the land agreement. No to just the West Bank. Basically, he wanted return to the 1967 borders, which was never going to happen, and control of Jerusalem, which also was never going to happen. He had no interest whatsoever in actually reaching a solution. So after nothing was solved in those 2000 Camp David Accords, the Palestinians launched massive waves of suicide attacks. This caused 1,000 casualties in Israel. And we're talking about school children, buses, nightclubs, all attacked by Palestinian suicide bombers. Again, no negotiation, no acceptance, no peace, just violence. Why? Because one side wants the other side dead. Period. End of discussion. So fast forward again. Now, 2008, a return of Palestinian refugees to the area and creation of the Palestinian Authority, which was headed by Abbas. Now, same problem. Abbas turned down another agreement in 2008, again, for the same problems. Basically, they wanted the old borders. They wanted total control of Jerusalem, particularly East Jerusalem, which in East Jerusalem is predominantly Jewish. One of the holiest sites in Judaism, the West Wall, is in East Jerusalem. So it was a futile negotiation. In the meantime, they decided to create a free, totally controlled Palestinian nation in Gaza. So Israel pulled out all of their settlements, by force in some cases, literally dragging some of the more Orthodox Jews through the streets out of Gaza. They removed everything. All their synagogues, anything Jewish was removed from Gaza. Egypt, the U.S., the UN pumped millions of dollars into Gaza to make this a true Palestinian Arab-only community and an example of how they could get along and govern themselves. So what happened in Gaza? Hamas happened in Gaza. Once they gained control, they took that money, and instead of rebuilding the infrastructure, an economy, nope, they made tunnels, they made command posts. They started importing weapons. And then they started launching rockets from Gaza into Israel. Now, at this time, they had free access. They had free movement, free trade. Nothing was restricted. As a result of what happened, Israel had to reinstitute restricted access. They had to reinstitute a blockade, and they had to respond, and they retaliated. And as is the fashion of Arabs, they naturally throw human shields in front of everything. They put arms and ammunition and weapons inside of mosques and inside of hospitals, because that's what they do. Now, again, presently, nothing's happened. Let's talk about the refugee crisis really quick, and because everybody focuses on the Palestinian refugees. Well, if you go all the way back to 1947 to 1949, when the fighting started, refugees, Jewish refugees, were forced to flee North Africa. They were forced to flee places in the Middle East to the tune of 850,000. These people fled certain death and persecution and certain death, and they ended up in Israel. One of the myths that has been perpetuated by the other side is, no, Israel was founded by European Jews. Most of the people in Israel, that is a lie. That is not true. In fact, most of the European Jews ended up in the United States. So the Arab refugees that fled were supported by the UN and the US, and are a fully funded, and I hate calling them refugees because they're not really. They were told to leave, and they were supported by the Arabs. They are a fully funded group to the tune of about $1 billion every year from the UN, the US, and other organizations. Now, the Israeli refugees that fled all those countries, how much money do they receive? Not a goddamn penny. Nothing. But they came to Israel to start over and create a country. So again, if you look at the country of Israel, what do you see? You see diversity. You see people from Ethiopia. You see people from North Africa. You see people who came to a country to establish a Jewish state, which is about the size of New Jersey, amongst an entire Muslim ocean of countries that extends across North Africa, the Middle East, Asia, into Eastern Europe, and yet, why is there a problem with one single Jewish state the size of New Jersey amongst all of these Muslim countries? Because it's about control. Because it's about intolerance and a lack of acceptance. Because true fundamental Islam has never, ever been about compromise, about acceptance, about tolerance. And the Palestinians, who are Arabs, and part of this, are a perfect example because they are being used politically as a counterpoint to the existence of Israel, which to this day, none of those countries will ever accept the existence of a Jewish state. And that includes all the terrorist organizations like Hamas, like Hezbollah. And Hamas's slogan is, we like death as much as Israelis like life. And if you've ever seen any of the videos, their children are literally brainwashed from birth to hate Israel. If you look at any of the textbooks, none of them will even show Israel in any of the geographic maps. Now, I spoke before about a two-state solution. Two-state solution already exists. It's called Israel and Jordan. Why? Because the largest Palestinian population in the world already exists in the country of Jordan. That's right. More that are in the West Bank, more that are in Israel. And make no mistake, there are tons of Arabs that live in Israel that are Israeli citizens that accept the government, serve in the Israeli army because they were willing to integrate. On the other hand, the Palestinian Authority, and just as recently as a few weeks ago when Abbas visited President Trump and again stated that they wanted to return to the 1967 borders. In other words, no negotiation, no peace, no acceptance. A hardline, hard-headed stance. So I say, you know what? The best thing for Israel to do would be to fully occupy the West Bank and expand their settlements all over it and push all the Palestinians who are Arabs into Jordan where they belong, where the largest population of Palestinians exists today in Jordan. So while some people might think that's harsh, that is the only solution that will ever work. And the fact that you've had so many opportunities, so many attempts by Israel in the past to negotiate and to coexist and be turned down, to be invaded, to have to put up with the random rocket firings from Gaza, the terrorist attacks. At some point, enough's enough. At some point, you have to realize that you will never, ever be able to coexist, to negotiate, or to get along with people who only want you dead. And what pisses me off is the amount of hypocrites in this country, in the U.S., and I don't mean just the liberal Democrats. There are Jews who are liberal who live in this country who are members of organizations that are anti-Israeli. Why? Because they buy into a lie. So, before I close here, I'm going to reiterate. Two-state solution, it already exists. Israel and Jordan. Get the people out that don't want to get along. Israel has a right to expansion. Israel does not need to give up East Jerusalem. They don't need to give up the West Bank. And there is no reason whatsoever demonstrated that they can ever count on the rest of the Arab world ever trying to accept them as a country or ever recognize their right to exist. And that, folks, is the truth. And if you don't like it, tough.